And joining us now, David Hulchanski, author of the report, The Three Cities Within Toronto. It's nice to have you back here in TVO.
Well, it's nice to be here.
Let's just do a little background before we talk about the new findings that you're putting out now. This is an update to a report, Toronto Divided, A Tale of Three Cities, that you brought out a few years ago. Give us the background to that piece before we get into the new information.
Yeah, we were lucky to get a 5-year grant from our Social Science Research Council here in Canada. And it was to study change in the City of Toronto, in particular for St. Christopher House, a huge social agency where the city is gentrifying. So one of the questions was to what extent is change happening too rapidly, maybe, for a social agency like that to be there, right? And if it really gentrifies. Well, then, in order to study that, we have to study the city. And then to study the city, how far back can we go? And this is where the long-form census comes in. I never used to mention this. Nobody would ever heard of it before. Right?
They know about it now.
Oh, yes. And we can go back to 1971 because the census and the long form were roughly similar all the way through. They made improvements through, but we can compare 1971 to 2006.
And the changes have been huge, and we're going to bring up 3 graphics right now to help demonstrate that which you have put into your report. You talk about Toronto actually as being not one city, but 3 cities. And here's city number 1, the mostly high-income neighborhoods in the city of Toronto. That's the blue. Then we add the gray, which is the middle ones, and that's city number 2. And then, of course, is city number 3, which is if you add all the low-income neighborhoods, you get quite a checkerboard picture of Ontario's capital city. This is a trend map. And what is the long-term trend that you have discovered with these?
Yeah, the key thing about that map is it is a trend. It's 2 points in time. So it's not a map of all the low-income neighborhoods or all the high-income neighborhoods, but it's how they're trending over 35 years. And it's been a persistent trend, in particular from the 1990s, the 91 census. It really takes off. So we now have 40% of the city in census tracts, neighborhoods, that are declining over time in income, in socioeconomic status. And we have 20% that are increasing quite dramatically over time.
Why?
Big changes in the economy. There are four reasons. This has nothing to do with city policy. There's things that the city could have done better and can do better now, but it has everything to do with affordable housing, the cost of housing. We no longer provide, in the 1990s, we stopped providing assisted housing.
Who's we?
The federal government and the provincial government both eliminated their programs that built social housing.
Starting when?
The federal government in 1993 and the Mike Harris government in 1995.
Okay.
Just turned it off, and except for some one-time programs, nothing much is happening there. Next is the labor market. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, one good job, one good civil service job would buy a house, a car, support a family of 4 or 5.
And vacation once a year, maybe.
Absolutely. I'm the oldest of 6. You know, my father supporting a family of 8 in a suburban house.
On one salary.
On one salary, right. The mother stays home with the 6 kids, right. That's what it used to be. Today, no.
Harder
one
to do.
salary won't buy a house unless it's a very high-end salary.
Or very low-end house.
Yeah. So affordable housing, the labor market, and then cuts in social supports. So when people got into trouble, unemployment insurance was covered more people and covered them better in the past. Social assistance covered more people and covered them better. The inflation-adjusted value of those is way lower today than it was back then.
And number 4?
Number 4 is discrimination. We're doing better. But our city number 3, that 40% of the city, is only 1/3 white. The 20% of Toronto, that is increasing all the time in socioeconomic status and income, is 80% white in a city that is now roughly 50-50 in terms of skin color. So we're divided that way also.
City number 1 and city number 3, the wealthier Toronto, the worse off Toronto. They clearly have different needs. Yes. Do they need different governments?
Different governments. That has never crossed our agenda. Referring to amalgamation, perhaps?
Yeah, we have all of it in one city now, post-amalgamation, which is 10 years ago.
I think we're better off.
11 years ago.
Pro and con, I've never been a big pro or con on amalgamation, but we would be in trouble if, I think in greater trouble, if we weren't amalgamated. We happen to have one school board. Schooling in city number 3 is difficult. Okay, families don't have time for their kids. They're working a couple jobs, lots of single parents and all that. And then services. Those areas did not have services because they were built for middle-income people with a car and everything I told you about before the 1950s, right? And they need services. So would they get services if Scarborough was a city on its own? I'm not sure.
Right. So you might be one of the voices out there saying that amalgamation, which the Harris government did, wasn't the worst thing that ever happened.
I sort of see it as sort of neutral. Either there's pluses and minuses. I'm not a fan, but it's, yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
The disappearing middle class. Michael, let's put these numbers up here because this is a huge issue across, well, everywhere in the world today, but you've got it in your piece as well. The proportion of middle-income Toronto neighborhoods in 1970 was about 2/3 of the city. If you go fast forward to 2005, we're down below 1/3. Why the declining number of middle-class neighborhoods?
Yeah. So when you introduced it here, you use the word middle income, and then you use the word middle class.
I shouldn't interchange?
So we have to be careful, right?
Okay.
Who is middle class?
Okay.
No, and we don't need to get into that, just that it's a big sociological term. Most people think they're middle class, right? They're very wealthy, and the very poor know they're not, but everyone else still calls themselves middle class. So we talk about middle income, and any researcher then needs to define it. So in this report, we defined it as being within 20% of the average income for the Toronto area. So at each year that we deal with, how many census tracts, neighborhoods, are within 20% above or below, so that 40%.
You're still talking about
middle.
that chunk in the middle.
Yeah, that's a big middle.
And that
so
chunk is
we
declining.
define the middle quite large, and as you just noted, it was 2/3 in 1970, and it's less than 1/3 now. And it has to do with the 4 trends we talked about.
Okay, but would it also refer to the fact that we've had so many new immigrants come to Toronto, and the neighborhoods that they're moving into, the people who were there are moving to richer suburbs?
That's a great point, but a bit of a fallacy there because we immediately think of immigrants coming to Toronto.
Well, they do.
Yes, and from 1965 to 1971, 275,000 immigrants settled in Toronto, and the most recent 5 years in the census was 450,000. So they're both very large numbers. It's more now, but it was a very large number in the 50s and 60s and all that. So we've always been receiving immigrants. And in fact, if anything, a lot of the immigrants in the past were poorer, right? We've changed our status.
So we shouldn't assume that that's the reason.
Right. There isn't a connection there, right?
Okay.
We're a city and a country of immigrants, and we always were. The immigrants who came in the 50s, 60s, and 70s came into a different economy.
Better economy.
Yes. And jobs, and into a middle-income society. So this is where the word middle class comes in. When you look at the people who study income inequality, and there's tax data going back from 1917 to the present, after World War II, things settled down. The top 5 or 10%, in fact, lost in their share of income by a little bit, up until 1985, roughly. And then it takes off. That is the top 5 or 10%. Gotcha. Takes off dramatically. That's the growing income gap then takes off. Whereas we were, the vast majority were truly in the middle. This is the city, this is the country, and we're not there any longer.
Let me show the low income numbers here because, okay, Michael's second set of numbers here if we can. This is the proportion of low income Toronto neighborhoods. And again, we're going to go back to 1970 to start out with, a fairly small number, 19%. Fast forward to the year 2005, more than half. More than half the proportion of Toronto neighborhoods are low income. Yeah. The 4 factors at play again here?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of those people consider themselves middle class.
But they're not really.
Right, they're not middle income. And that leads to a lot of frustration then. And it's not just in our country, but we see it in the United States also. There's a lot of resentment, and people know something's wrong, but don't know why something's wrong. And you get funny election results sometimes, right?
Well, okay, having now received this information, let's now talk about why it matters. Right. Why does it matter? Why should people be concerned about the fact that this capital city of Ontario seems to be polarizing into, in fact, 3 different cities?
And in fact, that the income gap is growing, and that the middle has disappeared. So we've doubled the number of people at the top, and we've hugely increased the number of people at the bottom. Well, there's a simple answer is that that's no good way to build a society. We should be building that more middle income society. There will always be inequality, that's for sure. Okay, there always was inequality, there always will be inequality, there always were poor, low income areas and high income areas in the city. Just we have so many now, that 50-some% of low income neighborhoods in the city. And in 905, it's 20%, up from zero. 0 to
So
20%
it's not a 416
in
phenomenon.
905. No, because somebody could say then the middle income people all live in 905. So when we first saw the graph and the map that's here, we did 905 and found the same trend. It's not as pronounced, but it's the same trend. And they went from 0 to 20%. So the answer, why there's many answers of why inequality is not good. There's not too many people who defend inequality, especially growing and dramatic inequality in a society. But it has everything to do with social strategies. All of us as individuals, households, families have to find a way to get the basics, make a living, right? And have more than the basics, right? So in a more equal society, we're all in it together, and things are sort of geared to all of us. Okay, we're average middle income, and prices, house prices, land prices are geared to that majority. We don't have that majority any longer in the middle, right? So high income people drive up land values and house prices for everybody.
So it crowds out
And
others.
then we have, we use the term affordable housing now, lack of affordable housing. We didn't use that term in the 50s or 60s because the majority of people were in the middle and the housing market was for the middle and people got their housing.
Well, let me talk about the extension of that, because here's the report, very nice looking report, I got to say, and you predict at the end of the report that these trends are going to continue into the future. Well, I think you've got 2025 as the year.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, what happens to this city if that trend continues?
Right, there's a big if, and then big letters in the report, if nothing changes.
Right.
Okay, because we got here over a 25-year period with small changes every year in public policies, in the private sector, in the job economy and so on. If we were to do small things every year for 15, 20 years, things would be different. But if we don't, we then are a city with 60% very low income neighborhoods trending downwards, and 30% of very high income neighborhoods trending upward. And the middle neighborhoods are 10%, they disappear.
Okay, take the affordable housing piece out of the answer you're about to give, because we're going to
Yes.
debate that for the rest of the program in just a minute. Aside from affordable housing, give me a recommendation. Give me a couple of recommendations as to how that trend could be turned around.
The federal government and the provincial government needs to do something in every budget for lower income people. So just name anything. It helps children, helps low income families, and all that.
So cut their taxes.
Absolutely. Anything like
Whatever.
that. Right. Child care, you name anything in those categories.
Better public
Especially taxes, right? Especially, right. Next then is what can be done locally. See, and this is where Transit City, by whatever name from now on, but city number 3 only has buses. Okay?
City number 3, meaning the poorest part of Toronto, only has buses.
Only has buses.
So there's
And
no
then
light
poor
rail,
buses- No.
not much
no,
subway service,
no,
right.
No, and that needs to be fixed.
Well, that's the thing that the new mayor has decided to cancel.
At the moment, yes, and that's being debated right now.
Whether he can
so,
or can't,
So that's number 1 is transit, is rapid transit for the rest of the city. Every great city's done this. We have not. 20 years of not investing very much in transit. Next is it's called tower renewal. Tower neighborhood
Fixing up all the
renewal.
rental,
Absolutely.
greening them.
1,200
Apartment
slab
buildings.
high-rise buildings scattered throughout the city, and the ones in the poorer parts of the city are the rents just don't support renovation.
Well, of the 4 things that you mentioned, affordable housing was at the top of your list, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of the program debating. So stand by, because coming up next, why can't thousands of Ontarians afford their own homes? Stay with us.